Abby. So, Trita, let's just get right to it. It's been more than 100 days since the horrific attack against Israel on October 7th, in which 1,200 people were killed. Subsequently, Israel's war on Gaza has killed more than 24,000 people, maimed more than 60,000, and displaced 2 million of Gaza's 2.3 million population. So, given the catastrophic humanitarian crisis that we're seeing there right now, what prospects do you see for a ceasefire? How close are we to it, either because of domestic pressure, regional pressure, or international pressure that Israel is currently facing?
Thank you so much. And as to this question, we are in a very bad situation, obviously. Just compare where we are now to October 6th. We have now major tensions on the Israeli-Lebanese border. We have daily attacks by Iraqi and Syrian militias against US troops and bases. Those had stopped entirely this past summer because of the truce between the US and Iran. We now have the Houthis shooting at ships in the Red Sea, and the United States shooting at the Houthis now. Once again, we're back to bombing Yemen. And it's only after the US hit the Houthis that the Houthis started attacking American ships. Prior to that, that was not their target. We have on top of that, of course, the war in Gaza itself, but also potential escalation risk between Iran and Israel. And unrelated to, but nevertheless happening in this context now, a very serious situation between Iran and Pakistan, which the Iranians have caused by shooting missiles into Pakistan against a base of an Al-Qaeda offshoot that had been done cross-border attacks against Iran. But nevertheless, that's a major escalation by the Iranians and potentially will beget a Pakistani response in the midst of an already very, very, very tense situation. You asked about the prospects for a ceasefire. In my view, the ceasefire has never been this type of an impossibility that the Biden administration has portrayed it as. At one point, Biden himself actually said it's impossible. It's impossible perhaps because he doesn't want it and he's not trying to get it. If the Biden administration actually wanted a ceasefire, the Biden administration has a tremendous amount of leverage to be able to gain that. Beyond just the regular support to Israel, Biden has shipped 10,000 tons of weapons and ammunition to Israel since October 7th. He's bypassed Congress twice to do so. He has twice vetoed resolutions in the UN Security Council seeking a pause. And according to Israeli members of the Likud party, they have steadily ignored the very meek requests the Biden administration has made of the Israelis. For instance, earlier on, Biden apparently asked for a ceasefire without a prisoner exchange. They ignored that. Biden didn't want them to attack the Al-Shifa hospital. They ignored that. And at the end of that comment, this member of the Knesset from the Likud party says, bottom line is the Americans have not given us a deadline or an ultimatum. So whatever pressure the administration claims it has put on the Israelis, it clearly is not of the character that would move the Israelis. In the sense that it's not an ultimatum, it's not real pressure. And that raises the question, why? But if we set that aside for now, I think we can ascertain that, yes, you're not going to achieve a ceasefire by accident. If you want to achieve it, you have to work hard for it, and the administration has not worked hard for it.
So I think I was reading in the Haaretz a few days ago that, at this point, Netanyahu has sort of told his people and he's told the cabinet that we're not necessarily going to win this war, or we don't know what victory will look like, but the thing is, we're not going to end this war. Is that, something that the Biden administration has sort of, what is their response to this?
Well, this is a very significant problem right there, because the way the Israelis defined victory early on was extremely problematic. They were going to root out all of Hamas, and all experience shows that that is not a possibility. In fact, in the same paper, Haaretz, Ehud Olmert, the previous prime minister of Israel, wrote an op-ed, and the first sentence of that op-ed was that the chances of actually defeating Hamas completely militarily is nil. So it's been clear that this is an unachievable objective. And unfortunately, the Biden administration signed on to the Israeli agenda without first asking, what is it? And how are you going to achieve it? So now we're involved in this in a plan that has no exit, led by a prime minister that has strong political interest not to allow this war to end, because the minute the war ends, his political career ends as well. So with clear interest of prolonging this, and the Biden administration unwilling to actually put any pressure. And that's how we have ended up with more than 24,000 dead. And I think, again, if the priority is to get the hostages free, the only time hostages have been released has been as a result of a ceasefire and a negotiation. The military campaign has not succeeded at all in releasing the hostages. On the contrary, numerous of them have died as part of that fighting, unfortunately.
Okay, so you said there's not enough pressure from the Biden administration, but then what about from the region? Like, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Jordan, Egypt, what has been happening and through Qatar, behind the scenes in terms of, and also the countries like the Abraham Accords countries. I mean, has there been any leverage there at all? Have they been talking to the Israelis about this in any shape, way, or form?
So many of the countries there have been very clear and been very adamant about getting a ceasefire, and they've been pressuring the United States because they don't have any leverage over Israel. The United States does. Administration is saying that some countries behind the scenes are publicly are saying ceasefire, but behind the scenes they're not. The only two countries that would qualify for that is, first of all, the UAE, and secondly, possibly Saudi Arabia. But when it comes to Egypt, Qatar, Jordan, it's very, very clear. These countries absolutely need a ceasefire, and they're saying the same thing privately as they're saying behind the scenes. But they are not the ones that have leverage. They're not the ones that are selling weapons to Israel. They're not the ones who are providing weapons to Israel. They're not the ones protecting Israel at the UN Security Council. The one international pressure that actually has had some impact already, I would say, is what the South Africans are doing at the International Court of Justice. Whether one agrees with it or not, bottom line is there's a decent likelihood that there will be an injunction against Israel there, that it will be a determination that a plausible case has been made that genocide is taking place. That will be a devastating blow to Israel and its standing internationally. But I think already we have seen that very advanced plans by the Israelis to do what they called voluntary migration. They were essentially going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and ship the Palestinians to whichever country that was trying to take them. The Biden administration was studying feasibility plans to see if they could be moved into the Sinai in Egypt. I think that has now essentially stopped, and I would attribute that clearly to the South African case, because if the Israelis want to make sure that they're not convicted of genocide, they cannot engage in that level of ethnic cleansing simultaneously as that court case is taking place, which then shows that international pressure can be effective. Will it be able to bring about a ceasefire? I wouldn't say that it's automatic or that the enforceability is there, but it will be a very significant factor in all of this. And quite problematic for the Biden administration as well, because if it turns out that the court decides that there has been a plausible case made that genocide is taking place, well, we're the ones who are providing all of the weapons for that genocide, and the Biden administration is going to find itself in a very awkward position.
Sure.
Can I provide some details?
I'm sure that.
Can I provide?
I'm sure there'll be an opportunity, Mr. Sears, later in the program that you can provide some more details. So I'm sure there will be more questions about that as well, the International Court of Justice. So Trita, but you just already mentioned some of the multiple flashpoints that we see in the region right now, right? With Israel's targeted assassination of Hamas and Hezbollah officials in Syria and Lebanon, the Houthi maritime.
Know the truth. Goodbye.
Houthi maritime attacks in the Red Sea and the counterattacks by the US and UK. And also, like you mentioned, Iran's sort of targeting of militant bases in Pakistan just over the past 24 hours. Which of these multiple flashpoints do you feel is going to be the most volatile and could ignite the region into a regional conflict?
I think at this point, the two ones I would pick out as being the most dangerous is what's happening in the Red Sea and the shooting war between the US and the Houthis. And the second one is what is happening on the Israeli-Lebanese border. The Biden administration is very concerned that the Israeli plan is to go into Lebanon. There's been a paradigm shift in the thinking in Israel. After the atrocities of October 7th, there is a strong belief that Israel miscalculated, thinking that it could live next to Hamas, live next to Hezbollah, and it paid a high price for it. So now it has to eliminate the threats. Which again is not a possibility in my view, and it will put a country into perpetual war if that's the type of a doctrine it wants to pursue. But that is where the Israeli thinking is right now, and the argument is that Hezbollah is much more powerful than Hamas. If Hamas could have inflicted this damage to Israel, imagine what the Hezbollah can do. So it's intolerable for Israel to have Hezbollah on its borders. So it has to push Hezbollah deep into Lebanon, which of course Hezbollah is not going to accept. And early on, this is what the Israelis wanted to do, according to the Biden administration, and Biden apparently, according to the Biden narrative, managed to push the Israelis not to do so. But it seems like we're back to square one now, in which the Israelis are once again preparing to go into Lebanon. This is part of the reason why they've been moving troops away from Gaza. So it's not a withdrawal from Gaza to end the war, it's a withdrawal from Gaza in order to shift the war. And this is a very serious concern from the US side, of course, because if there is a war between Israel and Lebanon, it will be even bloodier than what we've seen so far. Hezbollah has significant capabilities. There's a massive risk that will also then drag the US into it.
Right. But I mean, at the beginning of all this, I mean, soon after October 7th, I think there was a lot of restraint that was being sort of shown both on the Israeli and the Lebanese side, right? I mean, there was some constraint even in the way that Hezbollah responded to what happened on October 7th. So has that completely shifted now? Is there, and do you feel, what is Iran's role in all of this? Because, everybody says, well, these are, Iran-backed rebels, like whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas. And Iran was also quite measured in its response initially, but how has it sort of recalibrated this? And also in terms of how Hezbollah is going to respond to sort of Israeli provocations, how do you think Iran's role is going to be in the next few weeks?
So, as to the first part of your question, what is Iran's role in all of this? Iran has, without a doubt, of course, been extremely supportive of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been partly built by the Iranians. It has been supporting the Houthis, arming and training them, part of the reason why they've become a much more potent fighting force. And same with Hamas, but the relationship between Hamas and Iran is a very complex one, and it's actually been openly hostile for very long periods of time. Hamas comes out of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Sunni organization that is quite negative towards the Shias. In the 1980s, when it was founded, it was taking the side of Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Iran. So there was no love lost between Iran and Hamas back then. In fact, the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, was very anti-Shia and blocked all efforts to opening some sort of a relationship with Iran. And it's actually thanks to the Israelis assassinating him in 2004 that it opened up an opportunity for Iran to improve relations with Hamas. But even then, it was actually quite volatile because Iran and Hamas ended up on completely opposite sides in the Syrian civil war. Hamas was with the opposition and the Iranians were supporting Assad. There was a bit of a truce between them after 2017, but it's important to notice that this is a very different relationship than the relationship Iran has with Hezbollah. Now, both Hezbollah and Iran clearly were taken by surprise. This is what the US intelligence also found. They were not aware of this attack. They expressed support for it, etc., but they were not operationally involved or aware of it. And it also created some challenges for them because none of them were in a place to actually have a conflict with Israel at the time, and they still are not. Lebanon is in a devastating place economically and politically. Iran is also in a very tough spot. We saw the major protests last year. The economy is still doing badly. Iran is in no position to think that this is a useful moment for it to have a conflict with Israel. And that's part of the reason I think they have been very careful not to get themselves into a direct war with the Israelis at this point, and some have described it as showing a degree of restraint. The question has always been, for how long could they retain that posture if the war in Gaza continued, and if at the same time it was so clear that Biden was doing nothing to actually bring that war to an end? Because if you're sitting in Lebanon, you're fearing that after Gaza, Israel's going to attack Lebanon. And if you at the same time are seeing that Biden is doing nothing to actually stop the war in Gaza, then you're going to be left with the impression that the US is not going to do much to stop a war with Lebanon either. And as a result, you're not choosing war, war is upon you. And that may force or compel the Hezbollah to think that they have to take preemptive action against Israel if they think that an attack is going to come anyways. That's part of the reason I think it would have been much better for the administration to be very open about it and actually try and be open about trying to get a ceasefire, because it can also change the calculations of Iran and Hezbollah and make sure that they show restraint and they don't add any fuel to the fire.
Sure. I mean, and it did seem that way, right? That Iran was showing some level of restraint. But then what happened over the past 24 hours with Iran attacking bases in Pakistan? There was some analysis saying that perhaps it was more, yes, they were trying to get to Jaish-e-Adl in Pakistan, but also using long-range ballistic missiles, was trying to also send the US a message at this time that, this is what we are capable of. And as you are not calling for a ceasefire, this is what we can also be doing.
If that is the intent, and I've heard that analysis as well, but if that is the intent, it is one of the dumbest ways that they could do it. First of all, the US already knows, the Israelis know about the missile capabilities of Iran. They've been hitting ISIS targets in Syria at a distance that would mean that they could also hit Israel. They've been hitting him in Iraq. So, Iran's missile capabilities and accuracy, etc., is already well known. There was no need to show that again. But on top of that, to do so against a country that has nuclear weapons is your neighbor and will force that country to feel that they now have to do something in order to restore their sense of deterrence. This is not an effective way in any way, shape, or form of sending any message to the US except for the message that they don't know what they're doing.
Right. Okay. Well, and now I'm just going to sort of get to the last question before we open it up, Trita, and that is about the US response. Everybody, I think many people will understand the moral cost of the Biden administration's refusal to call for a ceasefire. But please help us understand what the strategic calculus is here. This is an election year, right? 61% of the American electorate, of which 75% of them are Democrats, have said that they're in favor of a permanent ceasefire and an immediate de-escalation of the conflict. The region looks like a power keg at this point, and Blinken just returned from his trip in the Middle East saying that is his number one priority, to de-escalate tensions in the region. So everything that's been happening is going in the exact opposite direction. So what insights can you give us about how the Biden administration is thinking about all of this, and what is their long-term plan here?
I think how I described what the Iranians are doing is pretty much the same way I would describe how the administration is handling this. There isn't much. I think the administration miscalculated dramatically in the very beginning. They gave away all of their leverage. They said that they will support the Israelis regardless of what they do. In the region, there is a very strong conviction that had the US not done that, Israel would not have conducted the war in the manner that it has, which is extremely indiscriminate. I mean, we're talking about 24,000 dead at a pace much faster than it happened in Syria, much larger number of children dead. I mean, more than about 15 times the number of children dead in Gaza in these last 3 months than that you had in 2 years in Ukraine. So I think the administration really, really miscalculated on that front. They miscalculated in assuming that much of their own base would be totally okay with this and that there wouldn't be a major backlash against this. I think he, to a large extent, has lost the youth vote, certainly has lost the big portions of the Arab or Muslim vote. They may be able to come back, but it's not certain at this point. And he certainly is not doing anything that would convince them to come back. If you saw the statement that the White House issued on the 100th day anniversary of this horrific attack, it didn't mention the suffering of the Palestinians, 24,000 at a single time at all. It's as if they do not exist. That's the message this administration is sending. I think there's a calculation electorally that they may conclude, and they may be right, that they're not going to be able to win back the votes that they lost. And that if they shift now, they may actually lose votes that they have managed to keep. But I think there's a third block of voters that they're not taking into account. A lot of other Democrats who haven't abandoned Biden yet, but may do so if this continues, and particularly if this leads to the US getting dragged into a war and Americans coming home in body bags. And add on top of that, if there is an injunction against Israel and the US de facto is implicated in it as well. All of those things I think are very dangerous. And to me, it means that he's lost a lot of support, but he can lose even more if he allows this to continue. But we're not seeing any indications of a shift of thinking so far there. And I don't think there will be much more unless the degree to which they have lost support in their own base really becomes clear to them, as well as the international standing, the loss of the US when it comes to international standing becomes really clear. To give you an example, the United States tried to put together this, I don't know what they call it, the coalition that would be guarding the Red Sea. Essentially, it's a neighborhood watch. Interestingly enough, not a single country that at first signed up to be in that neighborhood watch was from the neighborhood. They were all from outside of the Red Sea. Not a single one of them actually bordered the Red Sea. And then once it became clear to them that actually the US was considering or planning to hit the Houthis, almost all of them dropped out. France, Italy, Spain, they all dropped out. And the only other country remaining that was actually involved in the bombing was the UK, and a bunch of other countries that essentially expressed support for it, but had no significant operational role in this. That tells you something about how difficult it's become for the United States to convene countries to its side. I mean, that coalition of the willing is much smaller than Bush's coalition of the willing when he went into Iraq.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Trita. You know, for those who are just joining us or had joined us sort of a little bit late, we are going to be taking questions, but we have asked you to please submit them in the chat section so that we are, we can get to as many as possible. So, Abby, would you like to sort of take the first question?
Sure. So Trita, there's a question about the fact that Cy Hirsch had an article recently about the situation regarding the Houthis, and he compared them to the Viet Cong. And he was saying that the current strikes by the US against the Houthis are completely ineffective due to their mobility. So can you say if you agree with the assertions, and what are the implications of the current US actions?
So I have not read Cy's article. I have deep respect for him. But based on what you described of his article, I would say I do agree with him. I don't have the expertise about the mobility, etc. But bottom line is, what the Houthis were trying to do was to inflict a cost on the Israelis, an economic cost, not a military cost, to pressure them into a ceasefire. They did so by shooting or hijacking ships in the Red Sea, which obviously is a violation of international law. And they really wanted to choke off that pathway for Israel, and much of the port in Eilat essentially was dead as a result of this. The US chooses to engage them militarily. And what does that do? Well, what it does is that it actually increases the risk of ships going through the Red Sea, because now we're in the middle of a shooting war between the Houthis and the United States, which then means that the Houthis don't even actually have to hit the ships. They just have to try. They just have to shoot. And if they do so, most companies will conclude that it's too risky to go through the Red Sea, and they will choose another route, which is exactly what the Houthis wanted. But we just managed to make it more effective for them because we added risk to these ships going through the Red Sea. So it's completely counterproductive. So I think this was, again, one of these steps in which the urgency or the urge to do something got the better of us. Tactically, it felt justified because of what the Houthis had done, but strategically, it is highly problematic, potentially disastrous, because if we end up in an actual war over this issue, over these ships. Whereas there was an obvious de-escalatory option available to the president, which was to actually push for a ceasefire. During the 6 days in November, 24th of November to the 30th of November, when there was a ceasefire, that's when the Iraqi militias completely stopped their attacks. That's when the Houthis also stopped their attacks. There's only one Houthi attack against ships during those 6 days. So we knew that there was another option to be able to prevent the Houthis from doing what they were doing, but the administration did not pursue it. And I think it's highly problematic. And, you know, the US has already been helping the Saudis to bomb the Houthis for 8 years. And that did not lead to anything, you know, it didn't deter the Houthis, didn't back them off. In fact, they grew stronger.
Okay, so another question, Trita. Some might say that the US does not have as much influence over Israel as others might think. The billions we give to Israel, 4 billion annually, is a drop in the bucket of Israel's 500 billion GDP. Isn't it also rumored / confirmed that Israel has nukes? So if the US has no military or economic leverage over Israel, there are no levers for Biden to pull. Could you speak to this argument? Is it accurate, and do you buy it? This was an audience question.
I do not buy it, and I'll cite you an Israeli general who said in November in an interview to an Israeli paper, he said that if the Americans decide to stop providing the weapons, there's nothing we can do. We cannot continue this war, period. Because at the end of the day, the speed in which they're using up the munitions are such that they would actually run out within 5 days if the US didn't continue to replenish them. And again, as I mentioned twice, Biden actually circumvented Congress in order to replenish them for the Israelis as fast as possible. That provides us with significant leverage, decisive leverage, has nothing to do with 4 billion or more billions. It's about the fact that the military actually will come to a standstill if we stop providing the munitions and the weapons for it. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, 10,000 tons of munitions and weapons have been shipped already. If Biden truly wanted to put an end to this, he has all of the leverage in the world to be able to do so. Reagan did this in 1982 when the Israelis were in Lebanon and he had enough of it. He called up Menachem Begin and he told him that he will stop the delivery of F-16s to Israel. Begin was not happy, but within 20 minutes, he called for a retreat out of Lebanon. The US has leverage when it chooses to use it. It will cost the president politically, and I think that is the issue. He is not willing to pay what he perceives to be a political cost if he uses that leverage.
Great. Abby, do you want to go next?
Sure. So is there an international law that if you destroy a country's infrastructure, you have to fix it after the war is over?
So these matters after a war can go to court in which there can be judgments against a country, but the enforceability of that has always been very, very limited. I don't see a significant likelihood that the Israelis are going to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza after this. But there, as we mentioned earlier on, the genocide charge, however, has a completely different cost to the Israelis. To just put that in context, for the last 15 years, the Israelis have worked very hard to stop the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Not because the divestment or boycotts would have a particularly significant economic cost to the Israeli economy, but because of the fact that it would delegitimize Israel in the international community. But there's nothing the BDS movement could have done in delegitimizing Israel that would be even close to the delegitimization Israel will be facing if it is found to be engaged in a genocide in Gaza based on the statements of Israeli politicians and leaders themselves, which is part of the prime evidence that is being used against Israel. That will profoundly delegitimize Israel, potentially push it back to the type of isolation it had. Not quite that degree, but still significantly more isolated than it is currently.
Great, thank you. Another question about the West Bank. Will Israel eventually turn on the West Bank? It sounds like the environment is becoming more tense and more aggressive. in terms of Israeli attacks on Palestinians. And just sort of tagging on with that, Trita, I don't know whether you've heard, but I recently heard Professor Menachem Klein from Bar-Ilan University sort of talk about the fact that they have 300,000 reserve units sort of mobilized at this point, and there is some push for depopulating the West Bank as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, throughout this entire period, the Israelis have been expanding settlements and have been engaging and kicking Palestinians out of their territory in the West Bank as well. I mean, this has been a gradual process. It just keeps on going. The U.S. does nothing to stop it. And we've already seen, I think at this stage, more than 500 dead in the West Bank just in the last 3 months as well. So there's been fighting and more pressure over there, and with almost free reign to some of the settlers who are armed and who have been able to kill Palestinians and without much legal repercussions inside of Israel. So in whether it's the same approach that Israel will use there, whether it's actually going to try to push them out, etc., we're going to see heightened tension in the West Bank as well. And there, the Israelis don't have the excuse of saying Hamas is governing it, because it's not Hamas governing it, it's the PA that is governing it. So again, I think part of what has been so problematic in the last 10, 15, 20 years is that it's been very clear the Israelis have pushed to make it next to impossible to have a two-state solution. In fact, Netanyahu brags about it. It's part of his election platform to say, I'm the person who made sure there is no Palestinian state. And then on top of that, the United States under the Trump administration went for the Abraham Accords, which meant that instead of actually trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, we would now move beyond the Palestinian issue. The Palestinians are no longer relevant. They're not important. A belief that partly came out of what happened in the Arab world after the Arab Spring, in which so much focus was on Libya and Syria, and people were paying less attention to Palestine. And then assuming that that was a permanent situation, it clearly was not. But by essentially saying, you know what, the Israelis are going to take all of this land and it's okay. What's more important is that we have direct flights between Ben Gurion and Dubai. And that's what we're going to put all of our efforts into, and build an anti-Iran coalition with the Israelis and the Arab states. The signal that sends to the Palestinians was that there is no pathway to get your own state through diplomatic means. The peace process doesn't lead to that. Not only is the Israelis putting a stop to it, but the American side is endorsing it as well. And many of us warned during that period that this would eventually lead to the Palestinians returning to violence. No one would know how or when it would happen, but that it would happen, I think, was quite certain. And unfortunately, it has now happened on October 7th. And so we have to really look at our own conduct and the foreign policy of the United States to see how it has really deeply contributed to the chaos and the dangers that now exist there, precisely because we allowed the destruction of a diplomatic pathway to a two-state solution. And it is essential for us to help rebuild it. I don't think the U.S. should lead any efforts in terms of a peace process in the region any longer. We simply don't have the credibility, but we certainly should help, and we certainly should not stand in the way of it.
So Trita, you were just talking about the U.S. foreign policy, and there's a question here of, could you analyze the political support for Biden's Israel policy, the political support in the U.S.? What are the groups and sentiments supporting the policy?
So, in terms of numbers, it's not a lot of voters, but I think in terms of the type of financial support, etc., that various groups are providing for these type of pro-Israeli. I personally don't think it's pro-Israel. This is ultimately very bad for Israel. But the type of policies that Netanyahu likes, the pro-Likud policies, whether it's from Christian evangelicals or others, that seems to be a very big factor in the calculation of the administration. But in terms of votes, we've seen very clearly at 1.80% of the Democratic Party favored a ceasefire. And again, I think the administration is very much banking on the idea that Trump will become the Republican nominee, and that will scare a lot of Democrats into voting for Biden, even though he's not delivering on a lot of different issues, and even though he's doing what he's doing on Gaza. To a certain extent, I think that's right. But to a certain extent, it's going to cause at least two groups to either not vote or not vote in the same numbers as they did in 2020. The first one is obviously Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. And in some states, such as Michigan, that can actually be a decisive factor. The other group is Gen Z voters, younger voters. Many of them, of course, will be quite worried about Trump coming back. They will be worried about abortion rights, etc. But here's where I think Biden has a very significant problem with that group. First of all, polls show that unlike their parents or grandparents, they have absolutely no party loyalty. They're not loyal to the Democrats or the Republicans. It's not like 20, 30 years ago, you had your football team, you had your basketball team, your baseball team, and you had your party, and that was part of your identity. That is not the identity of young people in the United States. Secondly, they're not loyal to any politician. They're not following Reagan or, lionizing any of them. They're following policies. And if a politician they love follows the wrong policies, they'll abandon him or her. In fact, that's kind of what happened to Bernie, because Bernie has not come out in support of a ceasefire and has taken a lot of heat from the left for not doing so. And the Gen Z loved Bernie. They absolutely adored him. They barely tolerated Biden. So it's not a big distance for them in terms of seeing what he's doing, in terms of what the Gaza policy, disliking it, and feel like it's an easy thing for them to abandon it. So I think those are two major challenges that Biden has, and the only card he has going for himself is try to essentially scare voters of saying the other guy is worse. And the question, that will work for some, but it will not work for all. And the question is if Biden has the margins to lose some, because this is going to be a very tight election, and it's the small margins that will make a difference here.
So a quick related question is also, is it possible that Biden is trying to be a wartime president to shore up support for his election?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is it possible that Biden is trying to be a wartime president to shore up support for his election?
That would, if that is the case, then that would probably be one of the dumbest political moves. It's very clear. I'm not saying that the peace movement in the United States is as strong as I would like it to be, but I am quite confident that the war tiredness is very significant in the country. And as a result, anything that smacks of wanting to be a war president would be highly problematic. I mean, Trump is already saying that 4 years of Trump, no new wars. But then you had everything from Ukraine to Gaza, potentially Taiwan under Biden. True or not, it will be a message that will be resonating with a lot of voters who are tired of war. The idea that one would position oneself as such, I find it very unlikely. He may end up being branded as such, and that's frankly because of his own policies.
Trita, what role do you see for China and Russia, if any, in stopping the genocide?
For Russia, none. They can push resolutions at the UN, etc., but the Russians don't have much credibility themselves. I mean, just about a year and a half ago, we saw how the entire international community were opposed to what the Russians were doing in Ukraine. They may not have signed on to the sanctions and arming Ukraine policy that the US and Europe pursued, but nevertheless, they strongly disagreed with what Russia had done in invading Ukraine. China is a different matter. China does have an ability to play a diplomatic role. It's not extremely strong in that specific issue because they haven't been very involved. Many people were surprised by the Chinese doing what they did between Iran and Saudi Arabia. My own sense, based on conversation with Chinese officials, is that they've been looking to try to find out, can they be helpful in such a way that they actually would work with the US instead of trying to use this issue to further embarrass the US or isolate the US. But the challenge there is, so far the Biden administration, A, has not been pursuing a constructive policy towards a ceasefire, so there's a mismatch there. And secondly, the Biden administration does not seem to be open at all for the Chinese taking on a role. They believe, and I think to a certain extent correctly, that this is a way for China to show themselves as a responsible major power, how they can work with the US if the US treats them as a peer, as an equal, and those are things that the Biden administration clearly is not particularly excited about doing.
There was something, Mehbooka, just to follow up, there was something about the fact that China and Russia should both support South Africa's call at the ICJ because of the fact that they're all members of the BRICS.
I don't think that will be a driving factor. I mean, first of all, the South Africans have also asked countries to express support for it, but not try to formally join it because it will delay the process. But they do welcome if countries want to come up. But if I was the South Africans, I'm not so sure if I wanted the Russians right now to come out in support of this, or necessarily even the Chinese at this point. What I think is a bigger problem, frankly, is that some European countries have come out in opposition to it. The Canadians have come out in opposition to it. I think this is a very, very bad look. It's, the court is going to take up to 2-3 years to go through the evidence. How did Justin Trudeau manage to make a determination within 2 days? And how did John Kirby manage to make a determination while admitting that the US has not even looked into accusations of Israel abusing human rights?
Thanks.
Sure. A China-related question again, Trita. Do you think that part of the reluctance on Biden's part to hold Israel accountable is driven in part by fears that doing so would signal that America's commitment to long-term allies is conditional and weak to a great power like China, who is eyeing Taiwan?
I personally would think that we absolutely should have conditional alliances. We should not be unconditionally supporting countries because that unfortunately fuels a lack of restraint and at times even recklessness in countries. Whenever we have given carte blanche to countries, we did that to the Saudis, and look what they did in Yemen, for instance, or what the Israelis are doing right now. It's not good for them, it's not good for us. There may have been a calculation from the US side to signal to other countries that the US will stand by its allies, but very few countries will think that the relationship or the commitment Biden has to Israel will be replicated by the United States or by another president to another country. They will put Israel in a different category, and as a result, I don't think, if that is the message that is trying to be sent, I don't think that's the message that will be received.
So a few minutes ago, you were talking about Biden's possible reelection and, the dynamics between Trump and Biden. So there's a question here about to what extent does Iran's supreme leader want Trump to get reelected due to the regime's need for an enemy?
Well, look, I don't think the Iranians will need a Trump or a Biden to have an enemy in the United States. I mean, the tensions between the two countries as a result of bad policies from both sides is so high that it will be either Trump, Biden, whoever, unfortunately. Moreover, I think there is some truth in the idea that the Iranians need an enemy. Unfortunately, that's true for many different states. But if it was such a pillar of the regime's policies, which has been the conventional wisdom in Washington, then why did the Iranians sign on to the JCPOA, and why did they live up to it? It was the United States that betrayed that agreement, not the Iranians. So I think that has been highly exaggerated, and it's partly been exaggerated because when we say, look, the Iranians just want to have an enemy, it's a way for us to essentially make sure that we ourselves are not guilty. Our own sins and our own mistakes actually don't count. It's all because the other side just wants to have an enemy. And I think that's too simplistic.
I find that a terrific answer. Thank you.
So, Trita, about the tensions between Iran and Pakistan, there's a question on which says, do you think recent attack of Iran inside Pakistan is in response to reports of Pakistan sending Navy ships to secure trade routes in the Arabian Sea? and possibly seen as an accomplice to the US and its attack in Yemen? And do you see the situation escalating further between Iran and Pakistan?
I am not convinced that that is the reason why the Iranians did this. I think a more simple and immediate explanation, a more local explanation, is because of the pressure the regime was from some of the hardline elements within the regime itself, that they needed to do something. The very same logic we hear in Washington, restore deterrence. And that has been an ongoing pressure in Iran, precisely because the Iranians have not hit back against Israel when Israel took out their IRGC officials as well as generals. In fact, at one point, the Houthis were openly, publicly criticizing the Iranians and saying that the Iranians are not responding to what the Israelis are doing, and that's a mistake, and even something derogatory. So there's been a lot of pressure on them. And oftentimes when countries react to show that they are doing something, they end up doing something stupid. And that's what I think the Iranians have done in this case. I don't think there was a deeper consideration about the Pakistanis playing a role. I think it would be quite problematic if the Pakistanis were actually trying to break the Houthi blockade or getting themselves involved in that. Moreover, the Iranians have a sophisticated relationship with the Pakistanis. These are longtime neighbors. It would be even more foolish, in my view, if that was the reason why they hit Pakistan with missiles.
Right. And we'd heard that there was a lot of cooperation going on between the civilian and military leadership between the two countries as well, in terms of cross-border management and those things.
Yes.
Which is why it was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think about 2 days ago, there was 2 days before this attack was a meeting between the two sides on how to deal with some of these groups that are in the border area. And they're a problem for both countries. So, this is, I fear, a very, very severe miscalculation by the Iranians.
Great. Abby, are you going to go next?
Yeah. So Trita, does yesterday's tabling of the resolution brought by Bernie Sanders in the Senate, does that open up the US for more risk of being held complicit in abetting or assisting in war crimes and violations of international law?
I don't think it changes the picture on that front, but it does point out that Congress had an opportunity to do something about it, and it chose not to. And that makes Congress more complicit in all of this, not just the administration. But in terms of the United States as a result of the administration's policy, I don't think it changes that. But now Congress doesn't have an excuse. They had an opportunity, and the votes were, only 11 members of the Senate voted in favor of it.
Yeah.
Which also makes it interesting as to why the administration twice has gone around Congress for these things. It seems to me that they wouldn't have received much opposition if they had tried to go through Congress.
Good point. Yeah. Metlika?
Right. So I'm still looking at some of the questions. If the ICJ does not reach a conclusion that Israel is committing genocide, is there any useful response for progressives?
It's a very interesting question. First of all, I do think it would be a major crisis for the court if it's given the evidence. And again, not my area of expertise, but a critical component of being able to prove genocide is to be able to show that there was intent. And that is actually ending up being the easiest part of this court case. It's usually the most difficult part because countries usually don't express it very openly, if at all. In this case, it's just every day on Israeli TV by senior Israeli officials, including the prime minister himself. That's been at the very center of the South African case. So if that is not sufficient, combined with, of course, the massive death rates, etc., I think the primary issue is going to be a crisis for the court as a whole. How progressives should respond to, I'm not entirely clear on. That's a great question.
Metlika, you wanted to stop around now?
Maybe we can take 1 or 2 more questions, Abby.
Can I ask this one, please?
I think we're just going to take it from the chat, Jeffrey, if you want to
All right.
put it in the chat.
Yeah, I got it. I got it right here. In fact, I had it above further,
I'm
but
just
I'm
gonna,
gonna.
I'm just going to see what's here. What will it take for countries who are in opposition to the South Africa versus Israel, the Genocide Convention, to start supporting it?
Well,
Yeah.
it's very different from country to country, but bottom line is, if it isn't because of pressure from inside their own bureaucracies in favor of it, then public opinion can end up becoming a factor. I think the most important thing is to make sure that countries don't come out in opposition to it, frankly. I mean, we have the case in which both Canada and Germany has done so. According to Axios, there was instructions sent by the Israeli Foreign Ministry to all of their embassies, urging them to pressure the host countries to make sure that they come out and express publicly their opposition to the South African case. It seems to me that that is what prompted the Canadians and the Germans to do so. But when you take a look at what the public opinion is in Germany, 61% of Germans, despite the fact that there's hardly any open debate about this issue in Germany, 61% of Germans strongly disagree with the policy. They don't believe that what Israel is doing in Gaza is justified. So there's a significant disconnect between many Western democracies and their policies compared to where their public opinion is on this issue. So I think it's a matter of making sure that the public opinion is more effectively channeled in order to influence policy. And of course, that's exactly the same situation we have in the United States. Numbers are even stronger than that of the Germans.
Trita, were you surprised by Saudi Arabia's support of the ICJ case?
No, I think it would have been very, very difficult for the Saudis now to support it. I mean, the entire OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference, ended up supporting it. But take note, there was no press release by the Saudi Foreign Ministry about this. So it wasn't like an individual that Saudi alone does this. It was all part of a package in which essentially the Saudis were one in the crowd, but no individual statement or press release by the Saudi Foreign Ministry about this.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're sort of nearing the end of our program, but I can't thank you enough, Trita, for the context, the analysis, the insights that you provided. I can't say we're all leaving very hopeful, but I feel are leaving better informed about the situation. So thank you so much for that. And to everybody who joined us today, thank you so much for the time that you gave this conversation. We do want to leave you with a few action items before you. Oh,
sorry to interrupt, but it's a military coup.
So we do want to leave you with just a couple of action items. And the first is that please call your representatives, ask them to support Resolution 786 by Cori Bush. This entire hour, Trita has told us how important it is for regional stability, for, of course, the humanitarian situation that we have in Gaza, that we have a ceasefire. So please call your representatives and ask them to call for a ceasefire and support this resolution 786. So far, only about 64 or 65 congressional leaders have openly asked for it. So please do that. The other thing that we would like for you to do is also remind your representatives about the Leahy Amendment. It is prohibited under the Leahy Amendment. Congress is not allowed to authorize funds to militaries that violate international human rights standards. The case has been clearly made in the ICJ in terms of what is happening on the ground in Gaza. We've been seeing that. So please call your representatives and ask them to uphold the Leahy Amendment. We have to be able to uphold our own laws, and we do not want our taxes financing criminal acts. So with that, I am going to stop right here. If you'd like to learn more about our organizations, please go to masspeaceaction.org and CA4PG, which is the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice. I put in the links for both our organizations. Thank you all so much for being here. And Trita, once again, thank you.
We can't save the chat box.